I'm Bob Crawford.
I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
Man, Ben, I know we're not supposed to do this, but sometimes you got to ask forgiveness and not permission. Anytime you ask me to do a podcast where the research is listening to the Allman Brothers at Fillmore East, I'm in, because 20 years ago, oh my God, about 20, maybe more than 20 years ago, I lived in a house near UNCC where if you walk through the front door, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of hearing that album blaring from the turntable speakers. And one of the other opportunities would be you would hear Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. But that album is an old friend of mine. And so when you said that your friend Bob Beatty had written a book called Play All Night, Duane Allman and the Journey to Fillmore East, I said, I'm in. Let's do it.
Yeah, Bob, I'm pretty excited about it too. One of the things about that that's funny is I did walk through that door, Bob. I came to your house. I came to your house a couple of times when you lived over there. I think before you even knew Scott or Seth, I kind of knew who you were.
With Steve-O?
Yeah, with Steve-O. Yeah.
With Steve-O?
I still think it's funny that that in some world I knew you before you knew Scott or Seth. But you know what? Before all that is the Allman Brothers. And oh man, Bob, I'm gonna let you take the top of this. I've got there's so much I learned about this band because anyone who listens to the show knows I love music, but I'm not a music historian. And this actually explained a lot for me. So Bob, I'm gonna let you pick this up. But first, let's say, Bob Beatty, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen. I appreciate it immensely.
What is the journey for you writing a book about a Southern rock band in this period, right? The goal of this book or the climax is this album at Fillmore East. Why this band? Why this album?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of questions kind of packed into that, but we'll get to the kind of why this band first. Same time you were hanging out in that apartment or that house listening to the music, I was doing the same thing. It was actually about 30 years ago. And I got a greatest hits album. In fact, the preface says a greatest hits album changed my life, of a band that had no hits, really. Ramblin' Man was the number 2 hit, and they had a top 30 hit in late 70s. But for the most part, they didn't have hits. And I had been playing guitar at that point, probably about 10 years, maybe a little less. And I already knew about the blues. I'd already spent my time in punk rock, was really going back to these roots a little bit. So this band kind of came to me at an important young time in my life, and I found and heard the music, and I said, holy crap, what is this amazing thing? And I started at some point, you know what it was? Well, one of many things, but the box set, Dreams, which actually came out about in 1989, one of the big box sets of the CD era that really gave a lot of people a lot of information about the band. And it had this book in it, this booklet that just looked awesome. And it was really well packaged. And I read about their past and their history and, getting together and making and playing all these shows. And I heard the music something special, but then I learned, and then that they survived a pretty tragic death with Duane's death and then Berry Oakley's death the year later, and they stayed on the road. And then I got a chance to see them in 93, and they parted my hair. I had a lot more hair back then than now. I expected a nostalgia band, and I saw a living, breathing entity with Warren Haynes and Alan Woody, and Warren just played with the Avett Brothers the other night. So he's still going. And then here's the kicker. At some point, I read a review of a book on them, a 1995 book called Midnight Riders by a journalist named Scott Freeman in a fan publication by a historian. Who I've tried to get in touch with since and never have been able to reach. But his big argument was there is no why in this book, Midnight Riders. And I remember thinking, this is 95, 96, 97. Hey, I wonder if I could write a book on the Allman Brothers. At the time, I was just getting my history master's degree at the University of Central Florida. And I didn't do anything on it then. I didn't even know you could do music scholarship or research for academia. And I was working at a local museum and ended up moving to Nashville and starting graduate school in 2012, where Ben is teaching now, 2013, under Van West. And I literally told them, I said, I want to do a book on the Allman Brothers. That's what I want to do for my PhD dissertation. And Van was like, yes, let's make this happen. So I wrote, it's up here, 500 pages of stuff. Ben, you probably remember these things. You're still reviewing them, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That didn't say much. It turns out I thought it was done. And then a buddy of mine, a friend, another North Carolina person actually, read the dissertation and said, you just wrote a book on at Fillmore East. And then I had to figure out what that meant in relation to all this research and writing that I had done, pull it apart. And so why the album is best I can say is that was the record. That's why we remember Duane Allman and the Allman Brothers. If that album hadn't broke, and I tell the story that, the contingency part of history, I tell the story in the book. If that album hadn't hit, would Duane Allman be like Nick Drake, or even Graham Parsons, like this huge influence, but such a small, influence in a short period of time. So, long story short, why this album, that's why and how we remember them. I think each of us on this call will immediately think of that record. Most people do when they come to the Allman Brothers. I stopped with Duane said, this is the last piece of intro, and I'll let y'all continue. Because the story gets really ugly after Berry Oakley dies. In 1972, there's already been issues with the sex and families left behind, et cetera. But the drugs got bad. The success got really bad. They broke up. Greg married Cher. There was a drug trial. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to get into any of that. Let me just stop. And as a historian, that was the thing. You're telling a story about a contemporary subject. I could keep going, but I always was going to stop with Duane. I actually continued to Berry's death because I counted that last year of Berry's life and the band's life as a continuation, more of a continuation of Duane than afterwards. That's a long answer to your very short question.
Something about this book, and I guess this gets into it where it's the journey. This book is the journey to at Fillmore East. Is this book also the journey to the crystallization of the Southern rock genre, or an explanation thereof? Because I believe, and forgive me if I got this wrong, correct me please. You say that Allman Brothers, them and of themselves, weren't actually Southern rock at the time, but they kind of formed, defined what would be Southern rock.
Yeah. Bob, this is a great point. And I'll tell you, I've got a pretty active social media account at Long Live the ABB across the channels. And if you want to piss off an Allman Brother fan, you say something about Southern rock and the Allman Brothers at Southern rock. And I walk this line of fanboy and historian and everything in between. And the thing I had, let me do the Southern rock thing for just a second. The key point to this whole thing is, prior to the success of at Fillmore East specifically, Southern bands, and typically the leaders of those bands, had to leave the South to make it. And the Allman Brothers did it. They went to New York City to audition for Bob Johnston of Columbia Records, Dylan's producer. They came to Nashville and studied under John D. Loudermilk, recorded at Owen Bradley's barn, and put out a record on Buddy Killen's Dial Records, Buddy Killen from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. They went to LA to get in fancy clothes in the Hourglass and do this pop psychedelia. So they had to leave the South. They knew they had to leave the South until that last journey to LA is when Duane said, screw it, I'm going back to the South, and they made it there. So they're a Southern rock band, and best way to say it is a rock band from the South up until somebody, and no one's ever pinned it down, comes up with this idea of let's market all this as Southern rock. And that really comes out in 1973. The Allman Brothers release Brothers and Sisters, Marshall Tucker Band's first album comes out. Skinner's first album, I think, comes out in 73, might have been 72. But all of a sudden, all of these Southern bands are now sort of being promoted as something different. And the Allman Brothers are sucked right into that there. So they become both the founders of the genre and then these progenitors of it. But it's a different sound than what they started with. So most fans see this break, and it's just so pedantic, and it's kind of annoying to me. And I mean that like in a loving way, but it's like, why does this matter? And the biggest reason I think it matters is, number one, fans of any band, but certainly the Allman Brothers band, think their band is the greatest ever. So to compare them to anything else and put it in a lump sum is a problem. The second is, and I'm going to say it, the embrace of the Confederate ideology. This is a band that was a third black from 1974 to 1976. They had 2 black members. They always had a black member, and they toured with the Confederate flag as a backdrop. And, we know what the other Southern bands did, particularly Lynyrd Skynyrd, who continued that tradition. The Allman Brothers did it for a short period of time, but it was always the Allman Brothers didn't do the Confederate flag. And I have this whole collection of stuff related to the Allman Brothers and the Confederate flag in a folder just for that reason, So it becomes like this. To me, the argument doesn't matter anymore, but it really matters to some fans. And I was thinking about this, like, how do you identify, I guess now the Avett Brothers are called Americana, but when y'all first came out, like, that was so different than anything else anybody else does.
I believe it was a journalist, and I don't want to, I have a good idea what newspaper was, a major mainstream newspaper. When we first came out, said that we sounded like Robert E. Lee singing for the Ramones. This is 2002, 2003. And it wasn't meant to be an insult. And no one would ever write that now.
Nor should they ever have of a band that's not blatantly white supremacist.
But Ben, that wasn't even I'm sure that this guy's thinking, he wasn't thinking that's white supremacist. He was just using, cultural iconography. Would that be like, I don't think, I know there wasn't a hint of racism meant in what he said, but he was just pulling from these cultural symbols, I guess, in some ways, to define something that he couldn't define.
Yeah. It's funny, as an outsider to this, Bob, I remember when Scott had that art gallery down in downtown Concord.
Southern Star?
Yeah, going and talking to him, like 2002, I think, about the time that I was going to move up to Boone. And him just being like, we're doing great, but nobody knows what to make of us, and that's kind of a thing. Like, just being like...
And by the way, same thing is happening to the Allman Brothers from 69 to 71. Everybody, enjoys seeing them live. I think at the record, now I don't really, the record industry is still, I guess, going in 2002, but, like, you get the records and you're like, yeah, this just doesn't do it. The Allman Brothers, then you see them live, and that was the other reason why that was so important. One past point on your comment, Bob, about this is in 2002. So I know Scott Freeman, who wrote Midnight Riders, published in 90, I think it was 95, 94, 95. When he first posed to the New York publishing houses he first did his proposal, they said, nobody down there reads. This was 1995. They're talking about the South. So the stereotypes that are there about us, about the region, about its music, about, culture, Southern culture in general. That's not that long ago. It actually is. It's 28 years ago, but it's still a generation. My book came out. Nobody was saying, why are you writing a book on the Allman Brothers?
Yeah. And that gets to the point that I was making, the parallel there. Was that like someday, Bob, somebody's going to write a fantastic book about your band, and it's going to be a history of modern music in the 21st century. And I look forward to reading it because you guys highlight what's going on. So, Bob, you've studied Bob Beatty, 2 Bobs. It's enough Bobs, but it's too many when you're talking to them. So, Bob, it's interesting that you're looking at a time when here you have this movement within music. No one's quite sure what to make of them. Right? The live shows are what captures people's attention with them. So when you look at the origins of this band, right? You talked about how they come back to Nashville, where I guess the Allmans were born. They go out, they play with all these musicians. How is it that they managed to carve out not only a niche for themselves, but essentially to become something of the icon for this entirely new movement?
Excellent question. And I chalk it down to 5 factors. Duane himself, and I really spell out, I think, who he is as a musician and as a human being in terms of his determination to do what he wants. His bandmates, he had to find the right bandmates for his mix. And if you need to look at anything that shows that, if you look at the Hourglass, the band he was in prior to the Allman Brothers, prior to founding the Allman Brothers, it had Johnny Sandlin, who was a crack producer out of Capricorn Records in Macon. It had Paul Hornsby, who produced the Marshall Tucker Band and led them to great success. And Pete Carr, who ends up as a Muscle Shoals regular. And he played, if you've ever watched, I'm sure you have, ran on HBO forever, the Simon and Garfunkel concert for Central Park. You guys remember that? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've watched it because it used to be on HBO a lot. Pete Carr is the guitarist on that show. So, like, you have great musicians in his previous band, but something wasn't right. Okay, so you got musicians, then you got place. I think the American South is actually absolutely vital to this story, and I tried to spell out why. And it is a small town Southern story. It is not rural, the rural-urban divide. It's urban. It's just small town. Not even really suburban. It's mostly small towns throughout Florida. The fans, you got to capture the fans. And then the finals, the record industry. And I think this is the point I want to say to your question, Ben. The Jerry Wexler and Phil Walden, Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records, Phil Walden, Macon, Georgia, Capricorn, had a partnership that purchased Duane's contract from Rick Hall and Muscle Shoals. And they continued to dump money into the band as they're unsuccessful. Without that, those first 2 years while they're touring and they're several $100,000 in debt to the record company, they probably would have broken up as well. So it's a combination of all those factors, Ben, why it worked. And the record company, particularly Phil Walden, really believed in Duane as a concept and said, we're going to let this roll until we can't anymore. And they put all their chips on the table for at Fillmore East. Ballsy move.
Bob, talk about Duane's time in Muscle Shoals and how important that was and how formative it was for what he would ultimately do with the Allman Brothers.
Muscle Shoals has this mythos to it in all stories. You bring up Muscle Shoals and all the music that was recorded there. And few of us, I mean, really, I didn't think about it much until I got into this story. And then I read another book, just reviewed another book recently, how deep that culture is there in Muscle Shoals and how weird. It's a way out of the way spot. I'm sure you've all been there. Y'all have been there, but you have to want to get to Muscle Shoals. You don't just stumble on Muscle Shoals. Duane, it's a really cool story because he leaves LA. He's pissed. And he goes to probably one of the most rural places, in the middle of nowhere places he can in Northwest Alabama. 2 things happen there, I think, that are really essential. It's the only time in Duane's life he's not a road musician. He is not regularly touring or playing live. Now, that's not saying a lot. He died at 24 years old. But between about the time he's 16, 17 to 24, he is basically a road musician. So he settles in Muscle Shoals. And, I've got a couple of quotes where he says, I got my head back. And that's, to me, what says the South was important. He just needed to be home. The second thing, though, that happens at Muscle Shoals, and it starts in April of '68, they record a demo. It's the first track on the Duane Allman anthology that gets released in 1972, a B.B. King medley. And that's Hourglass, and it sounds like they want to sound like. And they go out to their producer in L.A., and they rejected it. This is awful. It was Southern blues. Listen to it. You can hear the Allman Brothers in that track. So Duane, I think, has Muscle Shoals in his mind. He goes up there and his whole time in Muscle Shoals, a little bit in September, a little bit in October. Then it starts November, December, January, February. So it's like 5-6 months is the only time he's there. And I think 2 things happen there. One is he settles down. The other is he found his way into the studio, and his big break was convincing Wilson Pickett to record Hey Jude. And it became a massive top 20 hit on pop radio, massive on, I don't know, I guess they were calling it rhythm and blues charts at the time, but basically on black radio. He convinced him to do this, plays an amazing solo at the end. that causes Eric Clapton to call Atlantic and say, who is that guitarist? Causes Phil Walden, when he hears it, he's with Rick Hall just in New York. Phil Walden's like, I'm going to sign that guy and make $1 million. He's the greatest thing I've ever heard. J. Johnny Johnson goes to Muscle Shoals at the behest of the crew in Macon, and says, we got this drummer. He plays so weird. We don't know what to do with him. J-Mo had backed up Otis Redding and Percy Sledge, for crying out loud.
What?
Arthur Conley. He was a rhythm and blues drummer with jazz. They send J-Mo to Muscle Shoals while Duane is recording with all of these artists that are coming through. And Duane calls Phil and says, are you kidding? This cat's burning. And these two would play together in between sessions in studio A or B down there. Duane with his amp cranked to 10, his Fender Twin cranked to 10. And Berry Oakley would come out, and eventually Duane quit session work. And what he says is, they want to pay me $5 to sit on my ass. I'm not a sitting on my ass kind of guy. So it gave him, Bob, the question that you asked was the opportunity to start anew and do something that he wanted to, simply by being in Muscle Shoals and playing particularly the Hey Jude track. But it's a string of hits. Aretha Franklin's version of The Weight is recorded there. So it's not just that, but that's really where it starts for Duane.
Yeah, that Duane anthology is incredible. I recommend anyone check it out who's interested in that. Where does Berry Oakley enter the picture?
So I just want to share I don't know if you guys do video, but I am wearing a Berry Oakley t-shirt. This was in honor of Bob, the bass player of his band. So
thank you, sir.
I'm really proud of the love I got for Berry Oakley, for how I wrote about Berry Oakley in this book. And I've gotten it from fans, like hardcores like me, and I've gotten it from folks, like y'all, interested people. Berry Oakley was a lead guitarist in Chicago, quit school at 17 to go on the road with Tommy Rowe and the Romans. Well, Tommy Rowe, who did the song Dizzy, and I think he had a song called Sheila as well. He was a rockabilly, but he really was a pop star. It's just weird to see Berry Oakley in this band. There's some clips, but he leaves Chicago to play bass, moves south, never wants to leave. He loves the South. He's affected a bit of a Southern accent by the time he gets rolling. But he is just a completely inventive bass player. He plays lead bass, which is similar to how he approaches guitar. Somehow he holds the foundation together while also driving the band. And I play bass because I'm a guitarist who can pick up a bass and play 4 strings. I'm not a bass player. So I have no idea how to do that. I know what it sounds like when I listen to it, though. Phil Lesh does the same thing in the Grateful Dead. Jack Cassidy does the same thing in the Jefferson Airplane. Berry learned from both of them. And Berry has a band with Dickey Betts. Dickey Betts is a well-known guitarist in Florida, and they end up in a band called The Second Coming, because Berry looks like Jesus, apparently. They hated the name. And Duane meets Berry going through Jacksonville, sort of like, Bob on tour. You maybe go out and you meet the local musicians and you sit in and play. And he'd been trying to recruit Berry all of 68. Once he met Berry and he started his concept, Berry didn't want to leave Dickey Betts. So Berry, Duane, and Dickey start playing together in Jacksonville, where they have Jacksonville, Florida. I know there's other Jacksonvilles, where The Second Coming is set up. And while they're playing, sometimes Duane will bring J-Mo with him. Actually, Duane moves to Jacksonville with J-Mo. And Butch Trucks signs up. But the quotes, and I've been revisiting my quotes from my social media lately, but, the basic quotes that Dickey says is, everybody kept saying to Duane, there's real magic when you and Dickey are playing together with Berry Oakley. And so that's how he ends up. He's like the anchor to these two artists who are really inventive guitarists. Duane is pretty set in how he does things. Dickey continues to get better as he's through this whole era. But very important piece. I think, I honestly, they have had a string of really great bassists in that band, all of them. Lamar Williams, David Goldfleece, Alan Woody, and Oteil Burbridge, who's now playing with the Dead, almost like a full circle thing. I don't know, Bob, how many of us listen to bass players, like when we listen. I do, and it's partially because of him. And I'll say Eric Avery of Jane's Addiction. Those two bass players and the way that they approach within their band are like nonstop.
Really, that's really interesting that you bring in Jane's Addiction. That's great. That's another conversation for another day. When I hear Berry Oakley play, particularly after not listening to at the Fillmore East for so many years, and then, like I said, being reacquainted with it, and I can tell you, what I was listening to the past few days nonstop was Chic and the great Bernard Edwards on bass,
yep,
and Nile Rodgers. And I'll tell you, people who like Lizzo, that's where that comes from. Chic. I mean, incredible band.
Yes.
Band. And then, I start listening to At the Fillmore East, and it is like I've said this probably 5 times so far today, like really like an old friend walking through the door, and you give them a big hug, and just everything is familiar and just warm. But I've become more of a bass player since the last time I listened to it. So the bass just stood out for me. And something you wrote in your book, the thing about the Allman Brothers, it's the blues and it's jazz.
Yeah.
And man, the jazz, in memory of Elizabeth Reed, that is the jazz. Talk about where does that come from in this band? Because it's so open and improvisational and fluid. Get into that for a second.
That's improvisation is a African American tradition, and I learned that actually writing this book, where that comes from. I've done a lot of thinking about sort of how to talk about the jazz and the Allman Brothers over time, and I speak about it a lot. And each time I say something, I'm like, God, that sounds so stupid. How do I say it? Let's start with, where does the jazz come from? The jazz comes from both the musicians' innate, I think, understanding of their approach to music. They are all very empathetic, sympathetic musicians to the moment. Jazz is very much about the moment for musicians, but the moment depends on all kinds of factors, right? It depends on your mood. It depends on how your bandmates are playing and what they're feeding you to do. Depends sometimes on the temperature of the room, depends on the audience. But the idea being that you can set a song form. I use Coltrane's My Favorite Things a lot as an example of this. So, My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music is a really simple show tune, Raindrops on Roses and Whiskers on Kittens and, all that from The Sound of Music. And Coltrane took that very basic form and made it into a 14-minute jam, a jazz excursion. So you've got the basic melody of the song and the basic song forms, and at different points, the musicians are cueing each other when they're coming out of solos or going into solos, etc. And the Allman Brothers, that's their mojo, is to follow that pattern. So Liz Reed has a set, in memory of Elizabeth Reed, has a set series of chords, a set series of movements, and then in between, the soloists go whatever direction that they want to, as long as they're coming back to the head or the basic form of the music, whatever that looks like. By all accounts, they were really good in that. So they're not playing jazz necessarily. And it's hard to say what is jazz and what isn't. Like, I know it when I see it, kind of thing. But they're playing, when you listen to them, and I'm now losing my train of thought, they're playing a riff. They know where they're going. They have no set path to get through those woods. They just know when they get to the other side of the woods, they'll play these different riffs or whatever to get you out. And if you listen to My Favorite Things, it's a great example of it. They start, they sort of hang on the vamp for a long time. And that just allows the musicians to do their thing. Sometimes I don't listen much to like Elvin Jones on My Favorite Things because he's holding it down so beautifully. But if I listen closely, I hear what J-Mo's doing in the Allman Brothers band. And there were 2 records, by the way, and I'll end here because I've kind of babbled through this. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, John Coltrane's My Favorite Things were really the 2 records that they listened to pretty incessantly, as I understand it.
I want to ask you a question here, because what's fascinating to me and what I learned about this, I like the Allman Brothers a lot. But I didn't know much about the band. I mean, first, something you've already covered is the idea that I came up always being like, well, Duane Allman died, that was the high point. And you've already answered this question, I think, but like, it's amazing to me that this guy was not the lead singer. He was not the chief songwriter. This guy was just someone who had this aura about him that, you think about bands, okay, bands will lose a singer and you're like, well, is it the same band, Or the songwriter dies, you got the same vocalist, but the music goes downhill. But this guy did neither of those things. He just built this band around him. And that to me is fascinating. The second one I'm going to ask you about, and this really blew my mind. I remember looking up on like Apple Music to find Allman Brothers songs that I like to put in playlists and being like, I can only find the live version. I wonder what happened to the actual album version. And I started reading your book and I was like, oh, they recorded the albums live, which first step in my brain is, good gracious, they're good. They did this all in a take. But it's kind of this moment, because the other live album I think of that I've probably listened to more than this is Band of Gypsys. Jimi Hendrix, recorded January 1st, 1970 at the Fillmore East. What is this moment we're in right here in the early 1970s where this is something studios will do? Because I think most of us come up listening to the live album is usually something a band will put off of a great performance in an off year or something, but it's not the central feature. So why in the early 70s did this become a thing that artists would do?
The first is because it worked. It sold. I unpacked this a little bit in the book, and Band of Gypsys, that's sitting up there in my collection from way back, the old Crackle version I bought at a used record store. The first record I bought with my own money was sometime in the late 70s. I bought Cheap Trick at Budokan when I Want You to Want Me was all over the airwaves, and that was my first record. And Dad had like at Folsom Prison, Johnny Cash, he had both of them actually, Folsom and St. Quentin. So for rock music, really the live record was a complete throwaway. It was, let's put some live stuff out in between album cycles or whatnot. The Beach Boys today and the Rolling Stones Got Live If You Want It really kind of opened the record industry up to, oh, wow, we can put this crappy product out and people are still going to buy it. And it leads to the real famous quote, the only thing live on it is the audience, because I think with the Stones, or it could have been Beach Boys or both, they're like, it was studio recording with live in between. They added the audience from these shows. Jazz musicians, rhythm and blues musicians had routinely put out live records. B.B. King, Live at the Regal, was a huge influence on Duane and Greg. Ray Charles had done a Live at Newport record. Everybody knows about James Brown doing Live at the Apollo. All of these were not good sellers, except Live at the Apollo, and were just filler. So it was unique to release a live record by basically a truly unknown band. And at that point, they'd sold maybe 150,000, maybe 175,000 units of 2 records over 2 years, and played probably 450 shows in those 2 years. So it started, I think, a trend, although, there's reasons for Band of Gypsys, which was Jimmy owed money to he owed an album to a former label that he had signed with before he became the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So that's why it's all new stuff. Cream had put Crossroads on Wheels of Fire, and they'd done some live cuts. It was okay to add live cuts to records. But yeah, once Fillmore East breaks, that everybody's like, let's hit record, see what we can fix in post, and put out records. And it became a thing. It is still a thing. Now, though, it's more like we're going to record a full show and release it. I've got on my notes of things I'm going to write about one of these days is bring back the live album. Curate a live album that sounds like a concert, like Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. Or Fillmore East. for that matter.
What was Fillmore East all recorded? Is that from one show in order, or did they curate from a series of shows?
It's curated 4 shows over a Friday, Saturday night. The big hitters, Whipping Post and Mountain Jam, which, by the way, Bob, that's my favorite Berry Oakley of all time is Mountain. Just my favorite piece of music of all time is Mountain Jam. But that's 55 minutes of the last 2 songs of the last show actually it was a 6-show run, but they only recorded 4 of them. So it's pieced together. It's a curated document. No overdubs, not a single overdub. They took out a harmonica solo in Stormy Monday to fit on the record. I'm convinced. And then they patched 2 versions of You Don't Love Me, pretty much when the two guitarists switched solos. So that it's not a live concert. Like even Band of Gypsies, though, I recall, is pulled from multiple shows. I think they have released the full set now, but either way, it is not a single show. It is they would record. They recorded the early and late shows on Friday. Went to Atlantic Studios to grab beers and sandwiches to listen back. And that helped them determine what they were going to record on Saturday. And then they kind of knew they had it in the bag by that 4th show. And Bob, I bet you understand this as good as well as anybody. When you kind of feel that there's a sense of relief, and they're walking a tightrope constantly, and they, I think, play with even less abandon, more abandon, I guess. The longer they got into that run, if you listen to the shows, and the whole thing has been released, so you can hear the development of the songs. If you're a real nerd like I am, I'll cue them all up in order. Like, here's all the Statesboro blues. Here's all the, just to hear the differences. But this is what I do.
And how many differences are there? Do you kind of pick up on? Just take it. Statesboro blues, for example. I mean, can you tell mood, energy from varying from one night to the next?
I mean, yes, you can certainly hear it in the first show in particular. Because Duane announces we're recording our 3rd album here, and they go and play. The solos are all different, of course. And there's there's some mistakes here and there, which happens live. Different times when, Dickey will come in early, or actually Duane missed a slide note during Done Somebody Wrong at the beginning, like those kinds of things. So yeah, you can definitely hear it, Bob. I've always known that the last show of the run, I'm not sure if I should look this up, if Liz Reed is from that show too, but you can definitely hear a difference. I'm not sure the general audience would hear it as well as I do. I guess many times as I've listened to these records, the flow is still the same. And, if you listen to shows from throughout that spring of 71 and through the summer, they're basically playing the same set list, and you can hear the differences. But the arrangements are a lot different in 1970 and 71 than I'd say 70. By 71, the songs arrangements had tightened up considerably. And so the arrangements stay pretty much the same. What changes is the solos more than anything else. And even the band comping beneath them, although I don't listen to that quite as much. Long answer to your question, Bob. Yes, this nerd can hear that stuff.
When you go back to this question of Duane Allman and the Allman Brothers, right? Like I said, I grew up hearing the story, Duane Allman died. He was, one of the great ones. And then, like you said, you'd go see them thinking it was going to be a nostalgia act. I think I saw him in 2002 and was just blown away. And this gets to this thing I've been realizing recently, is that this idea that, like, if you're a great leader or you build something great, it's all about you, that the singular person can do this thing. But I'm coming around to the conclusion that actually, if you are a great leader and you create something great, what makes you the greatest is building something that can last when you're gone. Because that's the beauty of it. You leave behind this legacy. Duane Allman dies at age 24, right?
24.
24 and 71. Right, sorry. 24, 71. He dies in 1971 at age 24. I saw that band. That's 7 years before I was born. I saw the band when I was 24 myself, and it was incredible. How does that story happen? Because it's building something larger, but there was a short-term breakdown within the band after he died, right? After Duane Allman died. Could you tell that story and then how it persists as a band?
Yes, to a certain extent. That, to me, when I was kind of wrapping up the introduction of the book, which of course happens at the end of the writing, you guys know it's writing, as I was pondering, like, what are the lessons here, right? And one of those is, yeah, this band lasted for 43 years after he died. And for the most part, following the formula he set in 1969 when they founded, they all set together. And so the story goes, this was probably the first time I remember thinking, God, this is a remarkable story. Duane dies. They decide to go out as a quintet. They didn't add a sixth instrument to kind of do that. They went out as a 5-person band and played a 90-show tour all across the country. They were never really an international band. And that saved the band. They immediately went in the studio and finished the Eat a Peach record, which was a top. So Fillmore East hit number 13, Eat a Peach hit number 4, then the next record hit number 1. So they were already ascending. They finished this record with Duane. I think it's remarkable that side A of Eat a Peach is just the 5-man band, as we call them in the thing. They literally started off by saying, we're going to tell you guys that we're still here. And we wrote 3 really great new songs. We're going to start with Ain't Wasting Time No More, which is our song about death, Duane's death. By the way, the song I play every time somebody dies in my life, it's the first song I listen to from 1998 forward. We're going to play La Brere in A minor. We're going to play this weird jazz jam that came out of a riff that Dickey used to play in Whipping Post. We're going to build a whole instrumental around it. And then we're going to do Greg's song Melissa, which was Duane's favorite song of his. So they basically announced, we're going to keep going. And they did keep going. Berry Oakley dies in November of 1972, also in a motorcycle accident, just like Duane a year earlier. And at that point, there's a quote Dickey had in a documentary where he says, at that point, we were just so damn tough. We didn't know anything but to continue on. And, again, the Greg was the face man, his brother. He wrote the songs, he sang. Dickey Betts also wrote songs and sang and became a front person at that point. But yeah, they lost their leader and everybody said that's it. But all of us in succeeding generations for the most part, we started with that band and then come to realize that, oh, wow, a lot has changed in between there and here, but it's still the music that moves me like it did back then. It says a lot about the musicians, their connections to each other. And they had some, they broke up in 1976 at the height of their success. They reformed in 1979, broke up in 1981 at the nadir of their success. Reformed in 89, more or less stayed together for 20. Well, they did. They stayed together for 25 more years. Parted ways with Dickey Betts about halfway through that.
And we mentioned the great Warren Haynes earlier, and we had him on stage with us the other night. And it's just incredible to hear his guitar and that voice. He can become a part of any band he's playing with. It's like he's always been there. And Warren, and we're not talking about this period of the Allman Brothers in this conversation, but I mean, Warren was very instrumental in the resurgence of the band. I mean, he wrote, songs that became Allman Brothers standards, and became the glue. He became, the glue that kind of like held the new Allman Brothers together.
And he joined in 89. Was he part of
89?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, that's a really good point that Bob mentioned. The choice of musicians that they did after, from 89 forward, adding Warren was he, because he had played in Dickey's band, he actually knew Greg and was a very, I've used this term a lot, empathetic, sympathetic musician overall, and incredibly talented. Overlooked in that is that Alan Woody joins at the same time, Nashville resident. Woody had never really played in a touring band. He'd been playing around Nashville a lot, and joined the band in '89 and was a continuation of what Berry Oakley had done, and to a certain extent Lamar Williams, and the band gravitated toward that. Those two were absolutely essential to that. They left in they formed Government Mule in 94 and left in 97, and they kept making good choices. Jack Pearson, Oteil Burbridge. When Jack leaves, they bring Derek Trucks in. Then they part ways with Dickey and they bring Warren Haynes back. And that's that last, when you saw him, Ben, from 2001 forward, they were the most stable lineup they had ever. Unfortunately, they didn't record a lot in that era. They were really only a touring band at that point.
Bob, before we go, Bobby, I gotta be selfish here and brag about my own department, about my own history department in Middle Tennessee State University, because Bob Beatty has a PhD from our public history program. His advisor was Van West, who is the state historian for Tennessee that we have at our university. He's part of this insane lineup we have in our public history PhD program that also includes my lovely wife, Kelly Kolar, who advises the PhD students in archives. Bob, you decided when you came back to do this PhD, you decided to come to MTSU. And I'm just interested to know, because you could have done this other places, but I wonder why you chose MTSU.
You kind of nailed it, Ben. I'll be honest. I moved to Nashville in 2007 from Orlando. I was working at a history museum. I'd already conceived of this idea. I'd already written the goal down. I'm going to write a book on the Allman Brothers. I'd written like 10 goals down, 97, 98, 99. Everything from get a house with a pool to get on hard money at Valencia Community College. At that time, I was on a grant-funded line, to learn to play slide guitar, to learn to surf, and then PhD book on the Allman Brothers. And at that point, those were the two that were left. I moved to Nashville partially because I had in my mind I could commute and do a PhD. I was in Florida, had a master's. I ran with a lot of PhDs. I always felt kind of not quite. I was like, I should have gone and gotten my PhD, should have done this, And so the opportunity to work with Van was enough for me. And, he is a state historian. I think the best thing Van did for me, many things Van did for me. Yeah. He is an outstanding historian. He's also an outstanding faculty member, because he gets us graduated and makes sure that we have jobs. And he's really smart about how he works all that. But one thing he did to me, it was the most he said about the dissertation, was he called me out for a howler in talking about Duane's genius over and over and over again. And his comment was essentially like, dude, he's a cover artist. He's a guitar. I'm talking about like the hourglass period. So I really had to stop and think about because of course, any good professor is Socratic in that, right? They're going to tell you.
Any good advisor grabs your feet and throws them back to the ground, and your whole body comes with it. And then you pick yourself back up and say, am I going to go on? If the answer is yes, you'll keep going.
There you go. There, you called it. You called it, Ben. That's exactly what it was. And, I had to back off that. So that was MTSU. I mean, it was local. It had a good reputation. It's been around for a long time. And the opportunity to study with Van, who literally told me as I was dicking around with this at one point, he goes, it's all about the effing music. Remember, it's all about the effing music. And that was, again, another one of those things. Okay, how do I keep it focused in music using all these tools of a historian, except, and then, I got to let people listen to it. So I have this whole collection of playlists on my YouTube channel, and I've got them on Spotify now. And I'm doing posts about them to say, here's how you listen to the music, because ultimately a book doesn't stop, at least not for me. There's a whole lot that is not in that book that I can still talk about and love it.
Bob Beatty, thank you so much. The book is Play All Night, Duane Allman and the Journey to Fillmore East. The album is at Fillmore East. Do yourself a favor, read the book, listen to the record, and repeat.
And you want more stuff? At Long Live the ABB, all over the socials. There's a couple lectures from MTSU. Actually, Ben, one of them has 35,000 views. I'm still stunned. Yeah, it's actually pretty cool. People are interested in this stuff. And I like music intersection with culture and history. Anyway, you know, it made the study of history so much more interesting to me from the very get-go.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bob. This is great.
For both of you, again, I mean it sincerely when I say the road to now definitely impacted how I approached this book and how I wrote. I listened to you guys a lot. I really have appreciated it over the years. And Bob, I can appreciate also getting a master's degree while you're working full time. I got a master's and a PhD working full time. And so I've watched your journey as I did my own there. So it really means a lot. You guys took some time to talk to me, and I mean that very sincerely. I appreciate both of y'all a lot.
Our pleasure, Bob. Thank you so much for your time today.
Really enjoyed talking to you. Hope to do it again.
Thanks a bunch, Bob. Tell Brother Warren I said hello.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, could we ask that you share the word about the show? That would be fantastic. You can give us 5 stars on whatever app you use. If you do it on Apple Podcasts, please give us also a little review. That helps spread the word. If you know someone who would like this, shoot them a text. Let them know. Say, hey, here's a great episode you might like. That makes you a better friend, right? You're sharing something great that makes your friends happy. Oh, that's that. Speaking of friends and being happy, we'd like to say a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon with a special shout out to our Washingtonians. Tanya Marsh, Mary Hocking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Regina Devine, and Chris and Teresa Adams. If you're enjoying the show and want to support our work, just head on over to patreon.com/theroadtonow, where you'll find uncut episodes, bonus episodes, and can even make your way onto the list I just read. That's patreon.com/theroadtonow. Our patrons make the show happen. For more on our show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can quickly search our back catalog and find links to content. And it's a good website because it was made by 7 Ages Design. Check those guys out if you need a website. The Road to Now, this very podcast, is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is the legend Gary Fletcher, and our episode today was edited by Ben Sawyer. Our theme music is Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this has Ben Sawyer. Take care.